everyone, my name is Shevya Singh and today I am presenting John Watson's contribution to the development of behaviorism. This is otherwise known as the beginnings of the concept of behaviorism. So let's get started. Behaviorism is known as observable internal events that can be scientifically measured and explained. It is the response one produces from the result of a stimulus. The environment and its factors, otherwise known as conditioning, determine it. Behavior psychologist John B. Watson outlines the principles of behaviorism in his book, Psychology as the Behaviorists Views It. An excerpt from this passage states, "Psychology as the behaviorist views it is a purely objective experimental branch of natural science. Its theoretical goal is the prediction and control of behavior. Introspection forms no essential part of its methods, nor is the scientific value of its data dependent upon the readiness in which they lend themselves to interpretation in terms of consciousness. The behaviorist, in his efforts to get at a unitary scheme of animal response, recognizes no dividing line between man and brute. The behavior of man, with all of its refinement and complexity, forms only a part of the behaviorist's total scheme of investigation." John B. Watson was a psychologist who attempted to construct the behaviorist school of thought for psychology. He was born on a farm near Greenville, South Carolina, where his family lived on the edge of poverty, relying on income through the farm. He received his master's degree in 1899 and went to the University of Chicago to pursue graduate work in philosophy. Watson received his Ph.D. in 1903 at age 25. He was the youngest person in the University of Chicago's history to earn a doctoral degree. Watson graduated with honors, magna cum laude, and Phi Beta Kappa. He is known today as one of the strongest advocates of behaviorism, and his school of thought continued to dominate for the next 50 years. After earning his Ph.D., Watson wrote the book I mentioned previously, known as Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It, which became very well known for giving behaviorism specific goals and methods. Watson emphasized that behaviorism was mainly based on sensible thought and the concept that learning is the biggest influence on development as well as behavior. At the dawn of the 20th century, during an era when progress was made through the productivity of individuals, Watson was able to stress that behaviorism was the key to success. He eventually had the opportunity to prove his point and was very successful. Watson stayed at University of Chicago as an instructor until 1908. He published his dissertation on the neurological and psychological maturation of the white rat, research that showed his early preference for animal subjects. He wanted to bring the professional interests of animal psychologists into the mainstream. In 1908, Watson accepted professorship at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. James Mark Baldwin offered Watson the job. Baldwin was one of the founders of the Psychological Review. A year after Watson joined, Baldwin was forced to resign due to a scandal. When Baldwin resigned, Watson became chair of the Psych Department and editor of the Psychological Review. At age 31, this helped him become a major figure in American psychology. In 1914, Watson's book known as Behavior: An Introduction to Comparative Psychology was published. The book argued for the acceptance of animal psychology and described the advantages of using animal subject in psychological research. Watson was eventually elected president of the APA in recognition of the personal network he had established with other prestigious psychologists. Despite all this, Watson remained focused on developing his behaviorist approach to psychological thought. In 1919, he published Psychology from the Standpoint of a Behaviorist that presented a more complete statement of his behavioral psychology and argued that the methods and principles he had recommended for animal psychology were also appropriate for the study of humans. The Little Albert experiment was a famous experiment conducted by behaviorist John B. Watson, who was interested in furthering Pavlov's research of conditioning. He did this by showing how emotional reactions could be classically conditioned in people. The participant in the experiment was a child known as Little Albert. At 9 months, Watson exposed the child to a series of stimuli where he showed no fear of any of the objects. When Watson made a loud noise by hitting a metal pipe with a hammer, the child would react by crying. After repeatedly pairing the white rat with the loud noise, Albert began to cry simply after seeing the rat. Watson wanted to see if an unconditioned emotional response would work, so he paired the sound of the hammer with a rabbit. Through this experiment, Watson concluded that our fears, anxieties, and phobias must therefore be simple, conditioned emotional responses that were established in infancy and childhood and that stayed with us throughout our lives. Watson used elements of classical conditioning in this experiment. Classical conditioning is known as the learning process in which an innate response to a stimulus comes to be elicited in response to a previously neutral stimulus. This is achieved by repeated pairings of the neutral stimulus with the potent stimulus. In the Little Albert experiment, the neutral stimulus was known as the white rat. The unconditioned stimulus was the loud noise, and the unconditioned response was fear. However, when the rat was paired with the loud noise, the rat became the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response was fear. This picture shows a similar example of the findings in the Little Albert experiment. In category 1, which is before conditioning, as Pavlov observed his dog, he found out that there should be a stimulus present which can automatically trigger a response. Since no learning is involved in the relationship between that stimulus and the response, both the stimulus and the response are considered unconditioned. In the experiment, the unconditioned stimulus is the food, which triggers unconditioned response, which is salivation. In addition, before conditioning occurs, the neutral stimulus must also be present to the subject. In the picture, when the tuning fork, or the neutral stimulus, is rung, no salivation occurs. During conditioning, the neutral stimulus and unconditioned stimulus are presented together. As shown in the image, the tuning fork, or neutral stimulus, is presented with the food, the unconditioned stimulus. This causes salivation, which is the unconditioned response. If the pairing is presented continuously, the dog will learn to create a connection between neutral stimulus and unconditioned stimulus. In category 3, or after conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned response becomes a conditioned response. This is due to the process of conditioning. The dog salivates just by ringing the fork, despite the lack of food presented. Although conditioning is a type of learning, it is said that there are no new behaviors learned. What is learned is the connection between the two stimuli. Some of the areas that can incorporate behaviorism are known as phobias that have been treated with behavior therapy, often through non-dangerous stimuli. Focusing on eliminating the symptom by bringing classical and operant conditioning into play in the treatment of phobias can help make vast improvements. By enforcing the extinction of the symptom, phobias can possibly be eliminated. The other way is through education, which uses a reinforcement and punishment objective through teacher and student relationships. Other examples are gender role development, behavior therapy, relationships, language, moral development, and aggression addiction. Vast improvements could also be made in the area of treating alcoholism and nicotine addiction. Addiction occurs through the effects of conditioned stimuli such as alcohol and nicotine, which some may find pleasurable. There is also the taste of both, otherwise known as the conditioned stimuli. When one stops ingesting the substance, it is extremely easy to become addicted again. However, if the taste of nicotine or alcohol, the conditioned response, is paired with a new unpleasant effect such as nausea and vomiting, the result will avert individuals away from the substances. Although Watson's career was short-lived, he had a huge impact on the development of behaviorism. He believed that psychology could become a science when it became possible to predict responses from stimuli. He also believed that psychology should be objective and experimental. Watson also applied classical conditioning to humans. He had a great influence applying behaviorism to advertising, and also made psychology more objective in methods and terminology. Behaviorism is the base of other forms of psychological objectivism. As one can observe, John B. Watson was an important contributor to classical behaviorism who paved the way for advancements in psychology. His famous Little Albert experiment provided evidence that even complex behaviors such as emotions could be learnt through manipulation of one's environment. As such, it became a standard base for behaviorist approaches to learning and is still widely cited in the early 21st century. Thank you for watching.